Afternoon. My name is Richard Ralph. I'm a former British ambassador to Romania and various other countries, including Latvia, in Eastern Central Europe. Much welcome you all to this third series of 3 webinars organised by LSE Ideas in collaboration with the Ratio Forum. If I could just give you the reference, it's hashtag Ratio Forum. I'd like to start off by handing over to Nikolai Ratio, who is the chairman of the Ratio Foundation and Forum, he'd like to speak about the Ratio Forum and to make a presentation of a journalism award to a very distinguished and courageous young Romanian journalist. Nikolai, over to you.
Welcome, everybody, to what is the last debate in this year's Ratio Forum Democracy Dialogues. Normally, this is a 3-day event that we hold in Turda, Romania, at the Ratio Center for Democracies base there. We've had to go virtual this year, which has opened new horizons for us, and as a positive, has certainly widened our reach, for which we have to thank Christopher Coker and Megan Palmer and the team at LSE Ideas for helping us do that, and for also David Sutton, who's the technological wizard behind the scenes, which is perhaps why we started 5 minutes late. No, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, we're here now, and thank you. Thank you for all our participants for being here today to join us, and for those also who've been with us earlier on in this week on Monday and Tuesday, where we had some excellent dialogues, and I'm sure today's will be as well. Welcome to our speakers, who you'll be hearing from shortly. Richard Ralph will do the proper what do you call it? Presentations. Introductions. Thank you. I'm losing my words. Just before that, I'd like to present the Jon Ratziu Journalism Award for this year. It's the 5th year of the award, and we give it annually to outstanding investigative journalists in Romania. At the Romanian Foundation, we're convinced that investigative journalism is and the support of investigative journalism is key to maintain an independent, if you like, watch on not only the nation but the media, who the general media in Romania do not pick up these stories. There's no money in it. Doesn't bring advertising, etc. This year's awardee is Jana Onshoi, a reporter from the independent publications of De La Zero and Sophie Lumina, which is in translation, that means "let there be light." The light that Diana is shedding upon in this, for the reason why she's been awarded, is on the shocking history of Romanian courts' handling of cases of sexual abuse of minors. Briefly, what the courts have done over these last years, and Diana will tell you much more about it, is that almost invariably they have found minors to be complicit in these sexual crimes, the abuses that have been perpetrated. It's quite extraordinary today that this still prevails, and Diana has been very brave to determined to actually expose it and bring it to light. So I will let Diana tell you more of that and her work. Diana is a very worthy recipient of the award, and we're delighted that it's her this year. And so I'm going to pass her the award, which is here, you see, and I'll pass it over to Diana.
And you were fast. It already got to me. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for the prize. It really means a lot. And first of all, it means a lot for the topic. I come from a country where judges think they can decide when or if girls who are 11, 12 or 13 years old, if they consented or not to have sex with men who are in their 30s, 40s or even 50s. So basically our judges say, well, it doesn't matter if she's 11, we have our means to decide if she consented or not. And if she consented, then it's sex with a minor and the aggressor will get a mild punishment. And if she didn't consent, then it's rape. But this is not all. Our judges are more likely to think it's rape when you have physical proof of resistance, when you have bruises on your bodies, hard evidence. If they don't exist, then they're more inclined to say it was not rape, it was consented, it's sex with minor. What I've tried to do through this investigation was not to show that, to show that we are not talking about exceptions, a case here or there, but rather we talk about a phenomenon, a practice that you see within the Romanian judiciary system that has so many shortcomings. First of all, it doesn't put first the interest of a child, which is the most important thing. Then it defines constraint, it's very limited defined. I mean, only if you have physical signs of your body, otherwise they take into account that you consented. And it's not something that I discovered through this investigation. It's something that Romanian state knows because Romania was condemned twice by the European Court of Human Rights, precisely on the grounds that I mentioned before, that they don't put first the interest of the child, that we don't have a unitary practice. And what was shocking for me reading the files is the arguments that the judges use in order to prove the consent. I'll give you some example. She didn't scream, that means she consented. She didn't scream too loud, again, it means consent. She wasn't wearing underwear, it means consent. The girl was the one who initiated, it means consent. She was staying on top during the intercourse, then she consented. Take into account that in all these cases, she is a girl who is 11, 12, 13, or even 10 years old. So this is the most shocking aspect that you have to see through when you look at these files. Because you're talking about also in this talk about the role media has in democracies. There was a response to this investigation, an institutional response. Basically, or eventually, the state decided to analyze all the files in the last 6 years dealing with the sexual crimes, with the minors as victims. So it's a small step, but at least something is happening. I also want to thank you for this award because I'm working for an independent media platform. This investigation and all the work I've done in the last 6 years, it's for this independent media platform, not for mainstream media. And this award is not only an acknowledgement of my work, it's also a support. And doing journalism in Romania nowadays, it's hard. I think it's hard everywhere with this crisis and everything, but in Romania it's hard for a long time because the media doesn't look good at all. So for me, it's a support because doing journalism is an everyday struggle, and this award comes in the right time. And because I want to end in a happy note, this award also makes happy my mother, because she adored Ion Rațiu, and she really thought that after the fall of communism, he will save us, or I don't know, make things in Romania better. So yeah, I thought it wasn't going to be emotional because it's online, but it is. So thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Warmest congratulations. Jana, that's really wonderful. I'd like to add my voice to that. Thank you. Let us now move on to the beginning of the conference itself. The title is, as you will be aware, Contemporary Challenges to Democracy, and it's the third of a series of 3 webinars on this general theme of democracy and challenges. This one explores how populist media and historical narratives are creating a crisis of self-belief in Western liberal democracies. We are very lucky to have 3 extremely distinguished panelists who are going to talk. The first of these is John Lloyd, a very well-known and distinguished journalist, contributing editor to the Financial Times, and co-founder of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. There's a number of books to his name, and the theme of his presentation will be populist journalism and the role of media in democracies. Our second speaker is Professor Christopher Coker, Professor of International Relations at the LSE and Director of LSE Ideas, who are, of course, bringing you these talks. He has a number of publications to his name, his most recent one being The Rise of the Civilizational State. He will speak on the general theme of the misuse and abuse of history by populist parties in the West. And our third speaker, and by no means the least, is Professor Jana Harland Matlari, Professor of International Politics at the University of Oslo. In that job, she specializes in energy policy, security policy, strategy, and political risk. She's also adjunct professor at the Norwegian Defence Command and Staff College. She has a number of books to her name, her latest one being Hard Power in Hard Times, Can Europe Act Strategically? She's a former Deputy Foreign Minister for Norway and a columnist and a foreign policy advisor. She will be speaking on the general theme of Western values. Each speaker has 10 minutes to speak, and they will talk sequentially, at the end of which we will have something like 40 minutes for questions and answers. And members of the audience, as it were, if you would like to submit your questions online, I think you use the hashtag Ratio Dialogues to do so, or through LSE Ideas, and then I will field those questions and feed them to the panelists as appropriate as we go along, and will then conclude the discussion. The whole event will have taken about an hour and a half. So if I could start off by inviting John Lloyd, please, to give his talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chairman. You can hear me okay?
I can indeed.
I wanted to follow your direction and do a kind of a tour of the horizon of journalism and populist journalism, and my other two colleagues, I think, will amplify, and perhaps even more, these can be amplified in the question and answer afterwards, for which we've got a fair amount of time. The first point I wanted to make about journalism is that all of it must simplify. In democratic countries, it's overwhelmingly a commercial business, and so must attract a large number of people, or a smaller number of the right people. In either case, the pressure is to make reportage or opinion quickly comprehensible, though the need to be absolutely accurate varies from medium to medium. So simplifying complex issue, if that is one of the elements of populism, and very often it's said to be, then journalism is in that sense systemically populist. Media which serve business and specialist and elite markets put a higher premium on accuracy of facts than popular or strongly political journalism. So popular journalism tends therefore to be also, at least in part, populist journalism, because accuracy tends to cut against full-blooded populism. So the upmarket newspapers, websites, educational media tend to be anti-populist, and so to do, at least to an extent, the public broadcasters in democracies, as long as they are independent of the state, or largely independent of the state, and that would include the Scandinavians, the Germans, British broadcasters. Others in Europe are more directly or covertly influenced by politics, as those of Italy, Spain, Hungary, and Poland, with France somewhere in the middle, tending towards the independent of government, but though it varies a bit. In some cases, the commercial media do better than the public media. For example, in Italy, Sky News is freer of the government than Rai, the state broadcaster. Secondly, the dominant ideology of journalism, that which is supposed to keep it on the right track, is contained in a book published about 20 years ago by two American journalists or ex-journalists, Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel. And the most important of their commandments, and they are kind of commandments on journalists, is first, the obligation is to tell the truth. Second, it has an essence of checking, of verification. Its practitioners must maintain independence from those they cover, write about, broadcast about, must serve as an independent monitor of power, especially governing power, and it must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. These are the main, there are others, but these are the main ones. So these speak to a very high standard of public responsibility, seeing journalism as indispensable tool of a democratic state, being an independent, as they say, monitor of power, something which, of course, an authoritarian state could never countenance, since authoritarian states wish to define what is the truth themselves. That ideology, these commandments of Kovach and Rosenstiel are very anti-populist, insofar as populism is defined as a movement which, when in opposition, seeks to picture any government as an out-of-touch elite serving elite interests, betraying the mass of people, making a series of promises to give the people what they want, irrespective of the facts, especially of the economy, and in Europe, strongly hostile to the European Union, which is not to say that all opposition to the European Union is populist. Third, there's a section of the media, which tabloids and talk radio most obviously, which play on populist themes. So even they, in democracies, are to a degree at least inhibited by wisps of the official ideology. In Europe, the populist nationalist parties have very small purchase on the media. There's no large broadcaster or newspaper which take up the program of, say, the Rassemblement National in France, or the Lega in Italy. They're referred to. Sometimes, occasionally, a right-wing paper, far-right paper will agree with them, but by and large, they're left out in the cold by the media. In America, talk radio and the right and left-wing broadcasters can count, are much stronger. And therefore, President Trump can or has been able to have a solid base of power in talk radio, less now from Fox News, which had been a very slavish admirer of his, but now is beginning to claw away from him, I think, as the election gets closer, partly because one of their main anchors would rather be like to be himself a president. Finally, where populist journalism does live is on the net, where it shares space, includes stories, fantasies, conspiracies, which come in from the public and can simplify or amplify these. Celebrities play a very large role in this, since they are very often little media centers of their own, or sometimes large media centers of their own. And Trump has proven a master in this, with tweets, setting agendas, running stories, and themes that gather energy and a kind of credibility, assuming that they last longer than a day, and some of them, of course, do. So the power of the social media, the power of the web, which increasingly is the place where especially younger, but not just younger citizens live, is the place for populist journalism. Sometimes you can't really call it journalism, but sometimes you can. Citizens journalism is on the web. And there, much more than on the so-called mainstream media, populist journalism does survive. Only, finally, in those authoritarian states, as China, to a lesser degree Russia, to a greater degree North Korea, most Middle Eastern states where the media is wholly or mainly under the control of the state, only there can populist themes really get going in the mainstream media. In China, Russia, these are aimed at keeping the population angry at democratic states, either because of past imperial outrages or present harmful policies, as sanctions. In Orwell's 1984, many of you will know this, that the citizens were treated daily to a 2-minute hate, where threatening and hideous images of a renegade from the all-powerful party are broadcast to everybody. It's compulsory to watch, and made more and more threatening until those watching are roused to a fury. Less dramatically, that is how authoritarian states strive to retain loyalty, through posing enemies common to both the powers that be and to the people. So, as a kind of paradox, authoritarianism relies quite heavily on populist support by whipping up animus, by whipping up sentiment against real or imagined enemies. Otherwise, populism in the democracies really lives on the net far more than in the mainstream media. Hello? Hello?
I'm unmuted.
Hello?
I hear you.
Ah, there it is.
Come on.
I had finished.
Thank you very much indeed. That was admirably brief and extremely interesting. Thank you so much. Move on to Christopher Coker, Professor Christopher Coker, on the misuse and abuse of history by populist parties in the West. Christopher.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Ah, excellent. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Rathiou family, Nikolai and Pamela in particular, for making this occasion possible. And we're delighted at LSE Ideas to be associated with it. We were associated with the dialogues last year, and we're very happy to continue our association this year. John spoke for 8 minutes. I will try to speak for 10 minutes. I promise not to speak for longer. History and populism. Well, history has become politically problematic, and it has become politicized, particularly in Europe. And I want to talk about Europe for the next 10 minutes. And two examples I will give you to illustrate the challenge that we face is first a tweet from the Italian Undersecretary of State, a member of a populist movement called the 5-Star Movement, who tweeted some time ago that the moon landing by the United States in 1969 did not take place, that it was fake history. So this is an introduction to the parallel world in which many populists choose to live. Now, every historian and everybody who reads history is entitled to their opinions about what happened, but they're not entitled to the facts. The facts should at least stand above those opinions. Hollywood has a wonderful word for this parallel world. It's called a side quell. You may know, we all know, that there are sequels to our favorite stories in Hollywood, to the movies that we like, and there are prequels sometimes. But side quell is just a different timeline that people choose to live in. And I love watching the Discovery Channel, which is all about aliens who lived amongst us, apparently unseen by most of us for millennia. But much more serious is the fact that there are people who live amongst us who believe that the Holocaust never happened. Indeed, Holocaust denial is one of the most important historical aberrations for many populist, but not all populist movements. A second example I give you is the leader of Spain's populist movement, Vox, who appeared on horseback last year in medieval armor, sword in hand, to the music of Lord of the Rings. And he was celebrating something that certainly did happen, the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Arabs, but his version of Spanish history, in a sense, makes the Arab period, which was for a short period of time one of the glorious moments in Spanish history, an unmitigated disaster. And of course, the episode is intended to be directed at Muslim immigrants. It's intended to be, in a sense, what it was, Islamophobic. So Europe, I think, has a particular problem with history because it has a problem of nationalism. Most of us, not of course my own country, which is about to leave, are members of the European Union, but there is no such thing as Europeanness. It's extremely embryonic, and most people, except for a very small elite, do not derive their primary identity from being European. They still derive it from being members of a nation state. And despite President Macron's hopes that the EU will turn into a state, there is absolutely no chance of that happening anytime soon, largely because nobody wants it amongst the European population. So the identity is linked still to the nation state, more so than ever with the COVID crisis. Who do we look to? We look to the state. More so than ever because of the 2008 financial crisis. We didn't look to the EU, we looked to our respective states. And the nation state in Europe is in perpetual struggle with the past. And it's that struggle which populists exploit. So why is the populist version of history so compelling? The populist version of history, entirely nationalistic, largely xenophobic, and directed largely at neighbors or foreigners. I think it exploits three important biological and cultural realities that we cannot escape. The first is that we're hardwired to belong to a social group. We are social individuals. There is no such thing as an individual without society. The second is that we are hardwired to live, and culturally hardwired to live, in a place. And that place remains significant in our lives for most the duration of those lives. It may surprise you to know that most young people in Europe, say in their 20s today, will spend their lives living within 20 miles of their place of birth. So the old canard that geography had been abolished by globalization or by technology is absolute nonsense. Most people live the rest of their lives in the place where they were born or very near it. The third problem is that we, because we're social animals and because we're territorial, we're loyal to the ancestors. And we put membership of a group before everything else. And that requires us to respect the history that the ancestors actually made. I want to take a famous quotation from Voltaire here, who said, "Those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities." And this idea has been taken to task by a cognitive scientist called Hugo Mercier, who's written a book recently, a few months ago. It was published, called Not Born Yesterday. That phrase, if you're English, you will know, "I was not born yesterday," means you can't fool me. And indeed, Mercier says you can't. We actually are very skeptical people. And when we're told lies, particularly by politicians, we can suss out the lies fairly quickly. But people who choose to say that the Holocaust didn't happen are saying this not because they're naive. They are signaling their wish to join a privileged group of people. So Mercier suggests we should reverse Voltaire's saying. It's because we want to commit atrocities that we believe absurdities. Versions of history don't get us to act in particular ways. It's because we want to act in particular ways that we believe absurd historical accounts. As Mercier argues, I think very persuasively, when a social belief and a historically objective belief clash or find themselves in conflict, a lot of people go for the social belief. They choose to go for the version of history peddled by the group to which they wish to belong. And that is why I see in The Economist this week that practically 99% of Trump's supporters in 2016 intend to vote for him again and will not be persuaded by anything that has happened, including his handling of the COVID crisis, that he is in any other way less than the greatest American president who ever lived, because they also believe that. They believe what he tells them: I am the greatest president. Now, when it comes to Europe, I think we're looking at two different parts of Europe. We're looking at Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and I'll start with the East. Populism in Eastern Europe is largely right-wing. A lot of populism in Western Europe, despite what we read in the newspapers, is actually left-wing. And I include movements like the Black Lives Matter. Not the entire membership of that movement, but the leadership of that movement is populist and left-wing and is peddling a particular version of history. The problem in Eastern Europe, if we take one country, I'll mention two, Poland, is that we moved from the stage in 1989 when East Europeans joined the European Union, and we're very aware at that stage of the suffering that they perhaps had imposed on other people and on themselves in the course of their history, to the point where victimhood has now become all important. We are the victims. Forget the suffering that we imposed on other people in the last 300 years of our history. And that, of course, was brought vividly to light by a book by a Polish-American historian who revealed that 120,000 Jews had to leave Poland after 1946 because of anti-Semitism. Polish anti-Semitism, not German anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism remains, unfortunately, a feature of Polish history for hundreds of years. Or take the statue of Admiral Horthy that I saw recently in Budapest. My problems with putting up a statue to Admiral Horthy is not so much the values of that particular man, but the values of the people who put up the statue. Always be very careful when statues are erected to people what they are meant to say. And they're frequently not celebrating the person who you think is being celebrated. They're celebrating the movement that has embraced them for a particular purpose. And in Western Europe, we have a different problem. We've lived for 20 or more years in universities, where I had been teaching, imbibing an ideology in which young people are taught that the West is uniquely malignant, that it is the source of most of the injustice and oppression in history for the last 300 years, and that the values that we believe in are values that should be junked. So when the European Union appointed quite recently a commissioner for originally the defense of Western values, but because that was so politically charged, it had to be changed to the promotion of Western values, it's not quite sure what these Western values are if you're young, because you've been taught essentially that there's not much that you want to value in your history, or indeed that of Europe as a whole. And the worst manifestation of this, and the explanation for why the far right is doing so well in Germany, is an intellectual class led by people like Jürgen Habermas, who've actually said that no patriotism can be based on history. It has to be based on what he calls a communicative rationality. That's dialogue with other people. So tell that to the Russians, and tell that to the Chinese, who are celebrating their history, whether it's the Great Patriotic War with the Russians, or whether it's the patriotic history courses of the Chinese. Now, the future that we choose depends very much on the past that we choose to remember. But who is doing the remembering for us? Is it the states, as it is in Poland? Is it populist parties, as it is in much of Western Europe? Is it the left? Is it the right? Is it in university? Is it in streets? I'm saying that essentially populists have managed to occupy a historical vacuum at the moment, because those who should be celebrating the history of their country, or in the case of Europe, of the continent to which they belong, find it very difficult to do so. And I'm going to conclude with one last observation. So if I'm allowed one more minute. I think the problem stems from the West's great success at the end of the Cold War. The end of history, a term that you may remember is associated with one American intellectual, Francis Fukuyama. What we saw was not the end of history, but what we saw was the serious study of history by politicians who bought into an academically rich thesis by Fukuyama. Fukuyama should not be in any way attacked for this idea, but it was taken to heart by the kind of people who think that they make history and expect to write themselves into it, politicians. And we live now in a historical vacuum where our politicians are unable to actually explain, particularly to young people, what the values of Europe or the values of the European Union are. And we are reduced, my last sentence, in Britain, to a semi-Churchillian figure, Boris Johnson, who has to, as Prime Minister, urge young people to sing Rule Britannia, to keep its spirits up in the COVID crisis. This is vacuous, and this is an example of the challenge that we all face in Europe, East and West, in very different ways, and why it's allowed populists, in a sense, to occupy the high ground of this debate. That is my end. Thank you, Richard.
Christopher, thank you very much indeed. That was extremely interesting, and it leads, I think, very seamlessly into the next presentation by Professor Jana Harland Matlari about Western values. Though I must say, if I can be just permitted a quick comment, I don't know, your challenge now is to define something that seems to be disappearing before our eyes. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much. This is indeed not very easy. And of course, a constructivist or total relativist might say that there are no values. There's nothing that can be defined. The act of definition is in itself repressive. I do not belong to those, so I will have to try to say something substantial in 10 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am very happy to be here. I'm sitting in Oslo, wonderful summer weather, quite few infections, so I should say it's fine to be here, but I'd much rather be in Romania, in Turda, at the wonderful Ratio mansion where we were last year, and where we had very nice conversation and meals. So greetings to the Ratio family for hosting us and for also hosting this conference online. I would like to start with this sort of East-West problem of Europe, because on the one hand we have a common European history. On the other hand, we see quite a lot of polarization for the time being between East and West. And that has to do with basic themes of democracy. I'm trying to write a book these days on the sort of the lack of power that Europe wields in the world. And one could maybe start by saying making the world safe for democracy again is a task for the Europeans, because the US is for the moment in a terrible conflict, in almost a civil war. It is so polarized that people are taking to the streets with weapons. So the situation in the US is instructive of what may happen in Western liberal democracy, perhaps also in some European countries. But by saying make the world safe for democracy, I want to underline that it is now Europe that has to be able to articulate what democracy means in the world, largely Europe, in a strategic competition with China, with Russia to a lesser extent, but with states that are quite authoritarian, even totalitarian. And we see that democracy is something almost natural to man. Now I said man, that's not politically correct. I mean the human being, and man means both sexes. So there's something natural about democracy. And look at Belarus. That's the good news for the time being, is the uprising in Belarus. People want to decide in their own lives. They want to have a say in their own political governance. And that's very natural. That's something we saw in Romania in 1989. That was my one and only political demonstration outside the Romanian embassy of Ceausescu here in Oslo on a winter night. I think it was December. And this was a true democratic revolution. And I think this is what should should be a cause for celebration. And people in Belarus, they've had sort of a pragmatic view of having a fairly good life for a long time, but enough was enough at some point, maybe spurred or triggered by the COVID. So there is evidently a need for people to be able to be free, to be self-governing. And I think the basic values of democracy, they are the ones we learn through political history. It is Aristotle, Plato, 2,500 years back. The human being is a social being and a rational being, able to reason also about ethical matters. And this has been the Western tradition. Democracy was certainly not promoted by these Greek philosophers. It was one of the worst forms of government because people were not rational enough for them, which is maybe a point for the populists to look at. But equality of citizenship and rationality, the ability to reason about matters of common interest, of the interest of the demos. And right now we see that the basic themes of democracy are challenged. For instance, equality of citizens. We have in the West, in Western Europe, Christopher mentioned it a bit, this crazy kind of tribalism, which we call woke, the wokeism, whereby groups try to get power for themselves, not by trying to be equal to others, but by trying to have rights, group rights for themselves, and by denying the right of dissenting opinion. There's a totalitarian movement that is really very clear. We see it clearly in Black Lives Matter, we see it clearly in universities, in various types of claims about colonialism, about discrimination and so on, where there is not any ground for discussion. It is not a proposal of arguments, of facts, of consideration of facts. It is simply a way of defining the party line. As we had in old communist systems, only the party could decide. If you disagree with the party line, you would disappear in the gulag, or at least lose your job. So this is, we who remember communism recognize the totalitarian streak in this, which is really surprising to me, that educated people, that media can go along in this kind of frenzy that we see in attacking people who do not disagree with these new ideas. And these are ideas that are not factually based. It's like Marxist theorem that capitalism is the evil of everything. Then you have discrimination or racism exists everywhere. So it's something you can't prove and certainly won't be discussing. So in the west of Western Europe, we see a lot of this, in Britain as well, imported probably from the US, but it is spreading in a way like wildfire. In Central Eastern Europe, there is little of this, luckily, so you should brace yourselves. And in Eastern Europe, this is probably quite foreign still. And it strikes me that the sort of pluralism in East Central Europe historically has been more objectively defined. There's a tremendous pluralism just in this part of Romania where Turda lies, where there was the first invocation, I think, of religious freedom back in near Turda in 1588, whereby Muslims, Jews, Lutherans, Catholics, and Unitarians were given rights to be different. And this is based on an idea that there are differences, religious, ethnic, cultural, that are rather permanent, and people are different. And in the Western Europe, there is no longer any, it's very secularized, there's very little historical interest. So there it is much more that one relativistically can define exactly what one is. One day I'm that, the other day I'm something else. So it's entirely different when we speak about multiculturalism in the East and West. And another issue that was mentioned here by Christopher is populism, nationalism, patriotism, and so on. It strikes me that it is now so contested to talk about nation. The nation as a national political community is immediately thought of as being something nationalistic, suppressive, and so on. Whereas a nation is basically a demos, people living together, having enough of a commonality to have a political community. And there's a lot of instrumental use of history, as Christopher mentioned, in today's political rhetoric. And history is unknown in the West, in Western Europe. Among my students, they know basically nothing of history. I hope they're not listening in here, but there's a striking lack of historical interest. And if history is invoked, it is history as I see it. It's not, this happened then, this was a fact. This, I mean, this is what we know about, let's say, Viking pillaging in England. No, it is history as I see it. I pick out a little piece of history. I like this and I like that, and I have it. There's no chronology, there's no contextualization, there's no fact-based knowledge. Whereas in Central Europe, there is sort of an extreme interest in history. I don't, maybe I'm biased. I have a Hungarian husband, and the Hungarians read history and talk about history. And of course, history is used politically. But I mean, there's much more of an interest in history in that part of Europe. In America, I guess there's the history they're interested in now is basically which statues can be pulled down. How can we use history and abuse history? So there's something very disconcerting about this, because democracy is not simply a social contract based on some instrumental rights and duties. It is more than that. It is a community that is thicker or closer. It's a community for which one is willing to sacrifice something. The taxman cometh. He does that all the time, at least in this country. But also conscription, which is has been reintroduced now in several countries in Northern Europe, Sweden, for instance. Conscription is your duty to fall for your country, for your nation, basically. And that is something so outrageous to a postmodern globalist that it's almost never comprehended even. So I think there's a lot today that needs to be, in a way, taken seriously again in terms of educating citizens. Citizenship is something, it's a maxim of democracy. It is based on a postulation of equality. We are not groups, we are not different, we are not living side by side in various communities. We're not tribes, we are a demos. We have a community if we have a democracy. And the education, civic education, education for public, in a way, in public affairs is sorely missing in our countries. Maybe because the liberal arts education is then in a way rejected in American colleges, courses in Western civilization and so on. And it's not because it's Western, it's because it is the historical tradition in which our way of government, our societies have developed. And the individualism that we are, as individuals, responsible for our actions, for our choices, that is also maybe Western civilizational value, but it is one that underlies democracy. And populism clearly is extremely dangerous, be it left or right. And in these COVID times where we communicate so much in social media, where can we meet to have political debates? Where can we meet as rational and social human beings? Social media certainly distort so much in terms of dialogue and argument and debates. It's not possible to have, in a way, a civilized interaction unless one does so with civilized people, but it's much easier to be extremely uncivilized in social media, even anonymously. So the situation presently with COVID is it's dangerous for democracy, also in the sense that we cannot really meet properly and interact, be it teaching or political meetings. And I think also it's very important that Europe be able to interact much more, that travel is possible again, not only for economic reasons, but the EU cannot in a way blossom unless there is much more physical interaction of travel and of work in the internal market. So it is quite critical that we don't get bogged down sitting in our own countries all the time. So this is perhaps, I've written here what to do. That's of course the important thing. I think it is very important that that one rejects this absolutely wild, woke ideology, that this is not allowed to get people sacked, to dominate the media. One has to be able to reject all these accusations of racism or whatever it is with debate, with exposure, and so on. And it is important also to reject the falsifications of history, all the politicization or instrumentalization of history that you find in politicians on the right, populist politicians that simply use history for their own political purposes. And this is in a way, one needs to get back to the proper role for politics in society, which is a limited role, even if one, needn't be a liberal or conservative to say that there is a limited role for politics. You can go back to the Greeks and see how they defined the common interest is the political, that is the common for all in society, and private life, academic life, work life, the economy belongs to the private sphere. The Greek word for economy, oikonomos, is for the private household management. So this and it is this constant criticism of Western civilization, European civilization, and so on. Of course, it's ridiculous if you look at the content of it, because clearly a lot has been done in the name of Europe, colonialism, and so on. But the fantastic civilizational values of individualism, of freedom, of rationality, all of that is the basis, very basis for democracy. And certainly other civilizations may be fantastic. I don't know much about them, but we are here in Europe, in our own continent, and we should be proud of the accomplishment of democratic government. And I don't mean to then be simplistic about it, but there is now sort of a self-flagellation which is absolutely unwarranted. I suppose you are gentlemen, so you're not interrupting me, but I think I have spent my 10 minutes. Thank you very much so far.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all speakers. We've got a number of questions which have been provoked by your very interesting presentations, which seem to me, if I may opt for a general observation, I mean, they dwell on the problem. The last speaker then sort of described some solutions, you know, a call to arms, if you like, in defence of European values and democracy. Quite how you sort of put that into effect is I guess, the challenge of our time. Could I just, on the basis of my diplomatic experience of two postings in two countries, one in Northern Europe and the other in Southeastern Europe, which, you know, had just emerged from behind the Iron Curtain, 50 years of communism, dictatorship, and so on, but looked to Europe. I mean, there was this sort of exhilaration of liberation, and the looking to Europe for values and reassertion of democracy. And here, and yet what we see is a Europe which is now questioning all of, or Western Europe, which is questioning all of those very fundamentals of our civilization, if you like. And those countries themselves, which seem to have become very disenchanted with you know, the fruits, if you want to put it that way, of liberation, of freedom, of a re-establishment of, or establishment of democracy. And I wondered if you would care, all of you would care to say a few words about that, and why, you know, why you think that has happened, whether it was inevitable, or whether it is something to do with the failure of institutions, or a failure of history, or failure of presentation of democracy, or what was it? John, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I was the FT bureau chief in Moscow when much of this was happening at the end of the Gorbachev period and then the first few years of Yeltsin. And I was also in Eastern Europe before that, before I went to Russia. And what one saw, and this has been commented a good deal by a number of people, including Fukuyama himself, but others as well. And that is that the people who really rejoiced, especially in Russia, when communism collapsed, many of them went over to Yeltsin and left Gorbachev. Gorbachev had been unpopular for some time. But some of them, the elite, did embrace and did seek to understand what civic society and democracy meant. I'm still chairman of a Russian NGO called the School of Civic Education, which began just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. The brainchild of a Russian couple, married couple, which is still going strong, but it can no longer operate in Russia because it's now declared an enemy of the people, or a foreign agent. And it has had a good deal of success. It got nearly all of its money from the West because the people with money, the oligarchs, didn't want to upset the Kremlin and therefore don't give it any money. And it's a good place for debate, for publication, all kinds of things. But it has remained willy-nilly, I guess, at a kind of elite level. And one sees in the rallying round of Putin, at the moment his popularity is dropping, but when he took back Ukraine, I beg your pardon, not Ukraine, the Crimea, and indeed when he destabilized and still destabilizes Ukraine, there was general approbation, especially of Crimea. Friends of mine, Russian friends of mine, would by and large say, "Это наши, it's ours." And of course, most of the people in Crimea were Russian speakers, and indeed welcomed the taking back to Russia. So that democracy and even more civic society came as a kind of patina upon views of Russia, which were much more imperialist in origin than, as Jana was saying, the woke contingent claim is true in Britain and America and France and elsewhere, the old European empires. There really was a feeling that Russia should be completed, that at least the Slav states, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, should come together again, and the Russians in Central Asia, in the Baltic states and elsewhere, should be protected or come back, or even Russia should again take them over, and so on. These strong and still strong feelings remained underneath, as I say, this patina of democracy. And now with Putin, at least democracy sort of functioned with Yeltsin. With Putin, it is simply a facade. It, of course, is much less so in Central Europe, although in Poland and Hungary, at least the attempt to control both the politics and the media have so far won out. But one sees in Poland in the last presidential election a very close vote between the PIS party, the Law and Justice Party, and the Liberal Party or Liberal Orientation Party. So still there's clearly a struggle going on in the Czech Republic. Politics are rather mixed, but there too there isn't we might call a great efflorescence of democratic feeling throughout the former communist world. I think by and large the assumption that we made, including many of us journalists who were working there in East Europe and in the former Soviet Union, the assumption that one could jump out of authoritarianism, even totalitarianism, into democracy, out of state-run economies. Richard, you will know this well from your experience there, into free market capitalism. The euphoria which helped power, as you said, that it was much more complex. The end of history was much more complex. Fukuyama's ideas were more complex than they have been rendered. Nevertheless, it did have in it a certain sense that an old has gone, a new has coming in, and yet we're still, at least in Central Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, we're still dealing largely with the detritus of the old, and the new is coming in slowly with, you know, as Vladimir Lenin said, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's not a wide highway towards a democratic and civic state.
Christopher, would you like to just intervene on that one too?
Yes, I'll concentrate on history since that's my theme today, and just make 2 observations, if I may. One is, I think that there's a historical cultural fault line that runs between West and East Europe. And it's very pervasive, and it's very striking. I was in Warsaw last week, and there they were remembering a great victory in 1920 over an invading Russian army, which was a great victory not only for Poland, but it was a great victory for Europe, because if the Russians had actually won, then the Weimar Republic would have been next in line. And if the Weimar Republic had been lost to Bolshevism in the 1920s, that really would have changed the face of Europe very significantly. The great prize being Germany, of course, from the very early days of Karl Marx and Lenin. With Germany, communism can't fail. Without Germany, it's a very different prospect. There was a Hungarian writer called István Bibo who wrote in 1946 the reason why the West Europeans are not unhappy to see the back of us. This was before the Iron Curtain had descended, but it was quite clear after 1946 that Eastern Europe was going to become part of a Soviet preserve, is that they think we're innately barbarous. And they think we're innately barbarous because we haven't shared their history. We haven't had a European Enlightenment. We didn't have the Industrial Revolution when they had the Industrial Revolution. We didn't even, though, as Jana pointed out, actually, there was importance in the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. But from the West European perspective, the Reformation and Counter-Reformation were purely West European historical phenomena. So I think there's this idea that Eastern Europe is subordinate historically, and that it must be part of a West European project. And that project is a historical project, and it's largely defined by our masters in Brussels. The second point I would make is that the East Europeans thought they were joining something called rejoining Western civilization. And many of the critiques of Soviet rule in the Cold War were critiques of Russia, Russian civilization, Russian culture. There were many East Europeans who refused to draw a distinction, much to the anger of people like Solzhenitsyn. But there was a difference between Russian rule and Soviet rule. And let's not get into that particular argument. the point I'm making is that they thought that they were joining Western civilization, and then they suddenly discovered that the West Europeans didn't know what Western civilization was.
Mm-hmm.
So they thought, for example, that they were going to join, well, let's be quite frank, a Christian club, and that's what Giscard d'Estaing thought, that the European Constitution, with which he was the chair, looking at the Commission, was going to actually say that Christianity is absolutely central to the value system of Western Europe. That doesn't exclude other religions either, by the way, but it does make a very fundamental point. Whether that's a purely theological point or a secular point, you can talk about Christian humanism, you can take God out of the equation, but you're still talking about a value system that derives from Christianity. And that's changed. They no longer think that's the case. And they've become rather skeptical about whether the West Europeans have any values at all. I mean, this commissioner who's supposed to be promoting Western values, well, what are these values? And just one example of how the East Europeans are fighting back. Latin is now being introduced in Polish schools as a mandatory subject, which is interesting since Poland was never part of the Roman Empire. But Latin, of course, is essential to Christianity for most of its history. But it's interesting that in Poland, you have a country that is reintroducing Latin as a mandatory subject in an attempt to put the next generation of young people in touch with the language that was central to the European imagination for most of our history in one form or another. So I think historically, there's a fault line that runs between the two, and I'm afraid that fault line is getting larger all the time.
Been addressed to you as rather provocative one, but it is asked why you think that democracy is natural. Says it has only existed for 100 years, and it seems extremely fragile. In the UK, we're supposed to be a democracy, but the questioner says, I've never had a feeling that my vote mattered. I had lived mostly in a safe seat. So on that sort of central point about democracy, I mean, it makes it sound as though it's not only a sort of a foreign implant, but a rather recent and fragile one at that. I mean, would you better respond to him on that? You need to...
Yes, thank you. Thank you. If I understood you correctly, it's this statement of mine that it's really natural in a way that we see the people of Belarus. I was in a so-called wise man's group with one woman, obviously, some years ago on Belarus, all the former foreign ministers around in the area and some others, and we tried to find a way to improve, in a way, somehow the Western orientation of Belarus. But of course, it founded the whole enterprise because we couldn't go to Minsk. We were not allowed the visa. So this was not, it was about 10 years ago, and we did write a report and nothing came of it, obviously. But now it is, in a way, I think people want to have freedom if they at all are able to. And this is something quite positive. It's something very nice. Of course, it doesn't have to be democracy, but to be self-ruled, to have a say in one's life, to be a political person, that is, I think, something very, very fundamental to human nature. And you could say the French Revolution, American Revolution, the Bürgerrevolution in 1848. There's a nice succession here of this. Hong Kong resistance, this tremendous courage of the students, poor students who try simply to have some measure of freedom and democracy. But to the question about East Central Europe, well, of course there was a tremendous optimism in 1990 on the part of all of us. It was the first time my husband ever got back to Hungary. It was 1990 because he was a class enemy. His father had been a general in Hungary, so they couldn't return. But this optimism was probably also covering a lot of naivete about how fast the change would be, because every country has to do the job itself, basically, We've had so much attempt at nation building, so-called nation building, democracy building, whatever, in various countries over the last 20 years, and we haven't really succeeded very well, Afghanistan being one sorry case. So that each country has to do the job itself. And I think one expected the EU to send its experts, and then that would be it. And of course, on the level of institutions, one saw the separation of powers and different the correct institutions in place. But as a Hungarian law professor said to me back in those days, he said, I have here all the laws, all the EU laws, all the human rights law. I have all the laws, and we call it show business. I can show it to you. But it doesn't penetrate deeply necessarily. And we have some studies of independence of judges in East Central Europe by large survey data that show that most people will say power really resides in what they call the system. And that's the in-group, the group that wields the power. It used to be the party, Communist Party nomenclatura, and now it is one group, either old communist or somebody who has replaced it. So this is, and I think think of Nazism 1940 onwards, and then communism for such a long period. So it's a 50-year period in which there is no democratic, sort of liberal democratic period. And it isn't all that long ago. It's 30 years now, but still, one must have, I mean, the only way forward is that there is countervailing power, that there is competition for power. This is, I think, the key thing. The Western European attitude towards Central Europe, as Christopher mentioned, has not always been very helpful either, because it's been very patronizing. There was a British ambassador in Oslo who said to me that you Scandinavians suffer from a moral superiority complex. And we see this in the attitude towards Central Europeans insisting on nation, preserving the nation, family, role of Christianity. These are definitely not popular themes in Sweden or in Norway or in general in Western Europe. So there's something about the issues that one disagrees on. We tend to patronize Central Europeans on these. This is too much right-wing, too much old-fashioned and so on, which is very unwise and not very fair. Thank you.
Could I go off at a tangent? We have a question which came in early in the meeting, and if I could direct it to John. It was that, do we have any observation on the drastic change in journalism taking place in the Indian continent? This is from a who writes in from India.
I'm no expert on Indian journalism, though I've been there several times. And when we created the Reuters Institute in Oxford, a number of Indian journalists came, among others, to be at the Institute, and I learned a good deal from them. The changes that I've seen, and perhaps the questioner knows something I don't, or is after a line of inquiry that I don't know much about, but what I have observed is that two things. One, that television, especially news and current affairs television, is fantastically raucous. It makes the American TV chat shows and even the Italian ones look fairly tame. And the scramble for eyeballs among, 600 or 700 different TV channels in India is extraordinary, because obviously eyeballs mean advertising, and that means profits. And there, the rawness of popular views on the nation, sometimes on Muslims from the Hindu side and vice versa, on the standing of women in society, on what you might call the social or sexual agenda of the West, in greater respect to people of other sexual orientations and heterosexuals. All of these things are chewed up and very often spat out in the Indian media, in TV, news, television over the last 20 or 30 years, and that most people watch television rather, now that it's more or less widespread, rather than read newspapers. And the other thing I think one should look at should note in India is that since the coming of Narendra Modi to the premiership, you have a much greater control, indirect but quite stifling at times, from the Prime Minister's office, from the government, from the state, over the media, and if you like, the independent media, the media which tried to do more or less reasonable current affairs and news. The channel, the New Delhi television, is always cited as being the best, though it's had to become a bit more raucous just to keep the eyeballs. That control, that they would say guidance, but actually it's control of the media, is now very strong. It was not absent in Congress time, but now in Modi's time, it's extremely strong, and people have been fired, programs have been cut, and the companies and individuals who control the news programs and the television programs, by and large, bow to the government because most of them have other interests than the media, and they want them protected. The oligarchs, if you will, the Indian oligarchs, are very conscious that if their programs stray too much into criticism isn't absent, but it's fairly light, then they may suffer. So that, I think, has been a much heavier issue in the past few years, and I guess will continue to be as long as the Modi government exists. And even when it goes, it will set a rather malign example, which another government, however it's composed, might seek to continue.
Thank you. There's a question that will certainly come from somebody with a Russian-sounding name, and may also come from Russia. But in any case, it is that, could we comment on the idea that in Russian universities, international law is almost entirely on Western values? Christopher, would you like to kick off on that one?
Well, I think Jana is the international law expert. Could I just say something on India? Because history is very important for the Modi project. And of course, disparaging the Muslim moment in Indian history is extremely important. So whether you're looking at the history textbooks in Gujarat, which now refer to the years of Muslim occupation, that's 500 years of the Mughal period, or whether you're looking at statues to Shivaji, who's an Indian nationalist, in quotes, freedom fighter, in quotes, from the 1670s, the tallest statue in the world. By the way, they intend to build another statue to another freedom fighter in a year's time that will be even taller than the statue to Shivaji. You have a rewriting of Indian history, and basically an airbrushing out of Indian history of a very important element in that story. So I'm afraid that the rewriting of history, or the politicization of history, is worldwide. But I think on the international law one, I think Jana is much better equipped than myself to reply to that question.
Thank you.
And I didn't really get the question. Was something about Russia or international law? I'm not a lawyer, but political scientist.
International law. It is. The question was an idea that's very popular in Russian universities, that international law is based almost entirely on Western values. Could we comment?
Oh, well, I edited a book on Russia, Ukraine, and Europe some 3 years ago, and we had a chapter on schools of law by a Norwegian military lawyer who wrote, I recall, that there are several schools of law in Russia. Statist school was one he mentioned, and that Western lawyers have dominated international law for quite a long time, and they are now challenged by both Chinese and Russian lawyers. So there is, of course, a sort of sociology of law element here, that how one interprets international law is not rocket science, certainly. So there is and if you the Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, is of course a renowned international lawyer who has dealt with international law for decades, and there is always the Russians will always offer a legal explanation, legal interpretation, like we do, and very often there is opposition between those interpretations. I guess one could say, as most lawyers say, that there is a legal canon, there's a legal method, there's a legal science or Wissenschaft, where there is something is good international law, well done, correctly interpreted, something is not. So there is a certain profession there, even though international law is very much realpolitik. So this is, many lawyers would pretend that not to be the case, but I think we know from diplomacy that that's certainly, there is some, in a way, there's some common element of common interpretation, but a lot has to do with political power.
Yes. Going to the end of our allotted time, wondered if we could just conclude. I'd prefer not to sum up, because that would be tedious. I think what people would be very interested in is if you could each speak very briefly in answer to this question: how can pro-democracy institutions and individuals best mount a defense against these challenges and threats to democracy? And Matlari, would you just seconds on that, and
you must quickly repeat it, because I couldn't get it.
So sorry. Is it? I wonder if I'm.
That's better. Yes.
Is that better? What do you see as the threat, and how can pro-democracy institutions and individuals best mount a defense against these threats to democracy?
Oh, that's the big
one,
issue.
but you have 30 seconds.
I get $1 million if I can answer that, I guess. Well, I think it's education, and it is to realize that politics is not everything in life, but it is important, and that is that one must participate, one must people, in a way, we can't complain to anybody in a democracy if things go badly, because we own it. If we break it, we own it, but we own it also before we break it. So this is to have this, what we call Bürgerpflicht in German. Citizens' duty is in English, but Bürgerpflicht is it's your duty to participate, to think of the common good, the summum bonum of society, to vote, to contribute. And that civic duty is something that we don't hear much about among the young people today. I think this is very important. It's a specific thing. It is not a hobby. It is part of life, because political participation is important.
Thank you. Christopher.
Well, I'll just be 15 seconds. I won't take 30 seconds. Self-belief. If you have no belief in yourself, then you can't expect others to believe in what you're offering. And you have to know what you stand for rather than what you stand against. I think most democracies in the West know what they stand against. They only have to look to China or Russia to see what they dislike, but they don't quite know what they stand for. And that, I think, is a very grave weakness.
And John, you have the...
Well, I can't add much to that. Again, I'll be brief. Two things. One, put in a commercial for the School of Civic Education, which is one of the major actors in former Soviet Union and East Europe in spreading debates and conferences and seminars and publications about civic society. Civic society, at least as important as democracy, how people can live together in society with respect and feel free to begin institutions, form into groups, and express themselves. I think Alexei Navalny, who, thank God, seems to have come through the attempt to murder him, does epitomize that. So you've got Navalny in Russia, you've got a growing, it seems to me, liberal society in both Hungary and in Poland, as shown in the Polish elections, as I said, and then finally, above all, needs constant support from the democracies. And we've been rather tardy in that. And part of it, I guess, is what Christopher has said, that we have our own self-belief, our belief in values and how values operate, our desire to have some kind of reset of relationships with people who certainly don't want that at all, has crippled us. But the groups and people and communities who are trying to work towards civic society, democracy, and so on, are quite numerous. I think becoming, in some states at least, more numerous, more courageous, and must have constant, even if it is only verbal support.
Thank you very much. Well, my fellow panelists, thank you so much for your insights. It's left us on a Friday afternoon or evening with much to think about, and in a sense a call to arms and a call to action if we are to rescue this, or to pull ourselves out of this crisis of self-doubt and about our values, about what we stand for. And I've certainly, all of that has resonated very strongly with me. I'm sure that the audience will have found it extraordinarily interesting. Again, thank you to all of you for participating, giving of your time. Thank you to all our participants for attending. And thank you to LSE Ideas and the RATSU Forum for organizing this extraordinarily interesting forum. Thank you so much.